I was driving and I received a phone call. It was pretty straightforward and simple, is Whakaari has erupted.
It's just after 2 p.m. on December the 9th, 2019. On the North Island of New Zealand, volcanologist Nico Fournier gets a call that he hoped he'd never receive. Whakaari Island has just erupted suddenly and violently.
The first question that immediately hits you is basically, were there people on the island? We all knew intimately that people on the islands probably meant that people got hurt.
By 5 p.m, there were no survivors left in the crater. 8 bodies remained on an active volcano, and now they needed to be recovered. The initial eruption was over, but was it safe to go back for them?
Then the activity underground started to pick up. So there could be an eruption, could be a bigger eruption.
The recovery teams were ready, the families were waiting, so everyone then turned to Nico.
The following days, probably the most intense days of my career. Military may be super good at what they do, but they don't necessarily understand volcano. My role on the day was to effectively giving the final green light from a science point of view. The level of uncertainty was huge. Our more experienced seismologist, he was asking me, what kind of threshold? What is your threshold there for me to call you? My best answer at the time was, when it makes you sick in the stomach.
1, 2, 3, 4. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of No Ordinary Monday. Thank you so much for joining us. I am your host, Chris Barron, and each week I invite a guest onto the show to relive their No Ordinary Monday story, an extraordinary event or experience that stands out across their entire career. We'll also discuss the path that led them there, explore what the job is really like behind the scenes, and at the end, they'll reveal the key lessons that they've learned along the way. Now, before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment to say a huge thank you to everyone out there who's left a rating or a nice review recently. I've seen them come in and it makes a huge difference, not just to give us a boost in the algorithms, but it also gives us a lovely boost personally as well. Seeing those messages come in really means a lot to us. So if you've taken the time, thank you so much. And if you're enjoying the show but haven't yet left a review, it's just a small thing and it really helps us grow the show. All right, so if you've been listening to the show recently, you might notice that we're on a bit of an accidental volcano run at the moment. A couple of weeks ago, we were inside an erupting crater in the Congo with expedition leader Aldo Kane, and today we are heading to another volcano, this time in New Zealand. My guest today is Nico Fournier. Nico is a volcanologist based on the North Island. His job is to monitor active volcanoes in the region, interpreting the data and helping authorities make decisions and advise in the event of an emergency. In December 2019, Whakaari, also known as White Island, erupted unexpectedly while tourists were on the island. 22 people tragically lost their lives. What followed was one of the most complex, emotionally charged, and high-stakes weeks of Nico's career. This episode is a special two-parter because there is just way too much fascinating stuff to cover in just one episode. In part 1, we focus on that infamous week, the eruption, the recovery operation, and the responsibility of being the person who has to say whether it's safe to send a recovery crew to an unstable volcano. In part 2, we zoom out and look at the aftermath, the investigations and the wider challenge of risk mitigation around volcanoes. How do you manage danger when we still struggle to be able to predict eruptions? And what does that mean when we're not just talking about volcanoes, but super volcanoes that can wipe whole countries off the map? So settle in and get ready to find out what it takes to operate between the edge of science and instinct. You're listening to No Ordinary Monday. Let's get into the show. Nico, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today, man?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me today, Chris.
Pleasure. So where in the world are you at the moment?
So at the moment, I'm calling in from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Aotearoa is the Māori name, but New Zealand, basically. So quite down under, basically.
And it's not quite a New Zealand accent I hear there.
Yeah, not quite. So I'm coming from slightly further north, more specifically from France, but I've been traveling around the world for life and work in general, and have been living here in New Zealand for the past 16 years now. So quite a bit.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, listen, I want to start right at the beginning. A lot of kids, probably including myself actually, and probably lots and lots of kids out there, love volcanoes. I mean, who doesn't love a volcano? It's like literal Mother Nature's fireworks, and they're just a spectacle to behold. But not all kids turn it into a career, like you have. I mean, what sort of spot? I mean, did you? I mean, obviously, I'm guessing you love volcanoes as a kid, but what do you remember the first time you sort of got that passion, that love for it?
Yeah, so it probably wasn't really a particular moment as a kid that made it, to be honest. So I grew up in central part of France, and out there we've got tens of volcanoes, if not more, basically. So the whole landscape, if you're familiar with the water Volvic, basically,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
water you can buy. I'm not sponsored in any way, but that's basically a few kilometers where I grew up. That's where Volvic was coming out
Wow.
as a spring. So we used to have Volvic water at home, at the tap,
Yep.
which was incredible because when I would
Wow.
take a bath, or mum would take a bath, we'd have these huge bubbles and foam over it because it was so pure. Um, but back to volcanoes, I guess the whole landscape had volcanoes everywhere where I grew up. So it was very much around us all the time. And also at school, it's something that we used to talk about quite a lot. So we would do
Mm,
field excursions, we would go and visit things, we'd look at rocks, etc. But I don't think that it's really registered as a potential profession yet. I think in the subconscious, it became something that was just part of who I was, I suppose, or where I grew up. And then later on, I just basically looked into, I love science. I got a really good love for science and love for the outdoors as well. So I think
mm,
in high school, I would do more science. And then basically at university, I thought, well, if I love the science and I love the outdoors and field work, earth sciences could probably be a good one. So that's how I got to it, basically just getting into earth sciences, etc. But it's only after the very first year at university I was working. So we finished the first year of undergrad, had a bit of a job for a couple of months, basically doing some climbing instructing, and just to get a bit of money. And the aim was to go to Italy in September, just before the next year actually started. And this
mm.
is when I went to Volcano and to Stromboli. And this is where I
Yep.
saw my first eruption with my friend at the time. So
Wow.
I think that's probably if there is a watershed moment, that's probably when it clicked like, right, this is really cool. And this is maybe something I'm going to be doing. So that's probably where it really kind of locked the whole thing together. And then from that point onward, it was basically just a question of keep studying and specializing in volcanology as the years followed.
Amazing. So yeah, it was really that sort of again that early sort of immersion in sort of volcanology and being surrounded by it every day. And then when you kind of get to university, you have, I guess, that little extra level of understanding of what you're seeing and how it works. I mean, even today, like, is that when you see a volcano, what is it? I guess just about the whole industry and the whole job that you do. What is it about volcanoes that just makes you so passionate and so interested to study them and work out how they, work and their dangers and stuff?
So it's if you had asked me that question maybe 20 years ago, shall we say? So
Mm,
I started actively working at active volcanoes probably 25 plus years ago now. And I think for the first 10 years, I think I really came to that career for the volcanoes. And what attracted me there was just the complexity of it, the beauty, the power, but really the scientific complexity of those processes. Because with volcanoes, nothing is simple. Everything is non-linear, everything is complicated. And I think that I had that particular thing that really attracted me. Now, interestingly, as the years went by, I think I came to volcanology for the volcanoes, but I think I stayed in volcanology for the people.
hmm,
And that's probably where I think a bit of a switch in career, maybe kind of 15 years ago, a bit more than that now, where really it's the inklings like volcanoes are awesome as things, but it's also they can actually have such a potential. I mean, good potential, but also a hazardous potential around people. Then that's really what keeps me going. So I think that's this kind of the two facets through time that have kind of shaped my career.
So it's like not the people as in the people you work with or the people in the volcano industry, the people as in like the general public kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the one. Communities is probably a better way to talk about it. Communities
Yeah.
and people living around volcanoes. Yeah.
Yeah, because even here in Mount Merapi, I think there's thousands of people that live on the slopes, and it's just we drive up there, as I said before. It's amazing that I know, I understand why, because it's such fertile ground, but also you're taking a big risk. So I appreciate you going around here and seeing the danger, and I'm sure they appreciate the danger as well, but trying to sort of figure out how do we mitigate the risks as best as possible. It's a big challenge, and yeah.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and it is a again, as volcanoes on themselves, nothing simple. Everything is
Yeah.
complex. But I think the relationship between volcanoes and people is the same. Is very complex. It's always at least dual faceted, basically. Where on one hand you've got the fertile land. It might be a land that even people are just simply culturally attached to, like here in New Zealand with our mana whenua, or the people of the land, even if there
Mm.
is no cultural agricultural activities around those. It's just their land. And on the other hand, it's basically how you manage the, I guess, the potential risks associated with that. And there is always that tension between things, which makes it both very challenging, but also very interesting from a career point of view.
Absolutely. And I've been extremely lucky in my career that I've kind of gotten close to volcanoes, at least one in particular, in a way that not a lot of people do. And it was a volcano in the Democratic Republic of Congo called Nyiragongo, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. We went there for a film shoot for National Geographic, and we were with a volcanologist. And the plan was to go and take a fresh lava sample from the lake, which is a massive lake, several meters across, I think. But when it started erupting and it became a little bit more dangerous, then you kind of switch from, oh, this is beautiful, to, okay, we are completely, at the mercy of Mother Nature here, which really resonates. We're in the gaping maw of this sort of unpredictable beast, even though we thought, oh, it's a relatively predictable one. It turned out, I don't think any volcano can be sort of deemed 100% predictable at any point in time. But yeah, I mean, we evacuated because it was getting, lava bombs were getting quite high and close to our camp and stuff. But can you think of any experiences that you've been in where things have kind of got a little bit dicey while you're in the volcano?
Yeah, probably more times than I would like to admit, I guess. Especially at a younger stage of my career, perhaps.
Really?
I mean, one that comes. I've had a couple of good experiences, and they're all funny in hindsight, but it probably not. Um, Probably
At
telling
the
how
time.
bit of stupid I was at the time as well, to be honest. So one of them was on a couple of them actually were on Mount Etna. So again, as a student,
Yep.
trying to actually get my experience of lava flows, etc. One in particular was I was basically staying at the one of the refuges quite high up the volcano, which was open at the time. And we knew there was a lava flow somewhere. So I was on my own, knew there was a lava flow coming down into one of the valleys, but the weather was all clogged up, couldn't see a thing. Basically, woke up in the morning and I'd be super keen. I've never seen a lava flows. Super, super keen to try and find one. And what's quite funny with lava flows, especially out there, is that they progress not too quickly at times. But what is really particular is that the top of the lava flow, when the lava flows are actually flowing, are actually moving, the top
Mm.
cools down and then makes those kind of very brittle rocks. And then because the top of the lava flow goes faster than the bottom, what tends to happen is that the front of the lava flow tends to roll under the front of the lava flow and then basically at the front there and then goes under. So what you tend to hear is all those rocks that were cooled at the surface fall at the front of the lava flow, get crushed underneath as the lava flow progresses. So you've
Hmm.
got this interesting, very peculiar sound of broken glass as it falls down,
Wow.
and then basically this crunch underneath. So I thought, sure, I'll use my ears and follow the sound, basically. Very smartly, I thought. And I did that for a period of time, heard that sound, and managed to basically stop somewhere. And I knew I was around there, and I could hear that sound, and there was a lot of steam, etc. But I stayed there, couldn't quite find it. And then all of a sudden, the steam opened up a little bit, and then still couldn't see much, but I could see there was some glows, etc. I said, okay, I'm not too far. That's awesome. And then basically clubbed back up again, couldn't get anywhere. So I decided to leave at that point in time, only to realize that the soles of my boots had melted. because effectively what I was doing, not very cleverly, was staying on top of the lava flow where it had basically built a bit of a bridge, so a solid bridge. So I was not, of course, standing on the lava, but it was hot enough that it would actually start melting things around. So that was perhaps one of those multiple near misses at one of the volcanoes, basically.
Wow. My dad's a geologist, and he, growing up, me and my brother were kind of forced to watch. I would say forced to watch. We enjoyed it as well, but I remember there was one very clear documentary about volcanoes, and in it, there's a scene where one of the volcanologists is walking over sort of a recent lava flow area, and his boot just crunches, like falls right through what looked like solid lava. And I think if there was, it was still steaming, it was still hot, but there wasn't any lava flowing through it. And if it had gone through with the lava, it would have completely melted his foot off. And I'm just like, such a scary environment.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest thing I've certainly observed over the years through that career, and not only mine, that of colleagues as well, is that there is always, you sometimes you push it to the edge. So the reality, I should probably state, is that the vast majority of the time, what we do is absolutely safe. We're not risk takers. Actually, quite the opposite, because we understand the
Mm.
risk. We're actually probably very risk averse in many ways. So it's not a cowboy profession where you just go and ride leather or something like this. It's quite the other way around. But there is a risk sometimes when you do field work around active volcanoes, and you've got a very strong, I guess, impetus to get data, to grab samples, etc. And you push the envelope a little bit, and nothing happens. It gives that full sense of security. And what I've observed, certainly, at least through a period of my career, maybe that unfortunate curve where you think you know more than you do,
Hmm.
um, where basically I think you can become a little bit complacent, and then progressively with the years go by, etc. You realize, actually, you know what, I'm going to step out a bit and being a bit more cautious in.
Absolutely. So you're kind of, as I said, you've passed that sort of stage now where you're, running into volcanoes to do what you're doing. Fingers crossed. And you're kind of in this phase now of like I say, focused on people, and the public and that sort of stuff. Kind of describe how that works. You're obviously, you've got to work pretty closely between the science of volcanology as well as sort of policy and all that kind of stuff. Like, so you've got to have a knowledge of both sides. So what is your sort of role now? How would you describe it? Are you like a diagnostician or someone like how would you describe your role?
So the role, so I guess my role is probably a role of connector between connector between the science and the people using the output of the science. That's probably
Hmm.
one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is to be an enabler whenever decisions have to be made around volcanoes, whether it's about accessing specific areas or whether it's about evacuating people, is about enabling the authorities. Often it's the government or local authorities that have to make the decision, to basically enabling them to make them by providing them with basically fact-based evidence or evidence-based in kind of decision-making tools. So one thing that is probably important, especially if some people listening here, for instance, are interested in what do you do to become a volcanologist? One of the important things is that nearly none of the studies will actually prepare you to interact with people. So the vast majority of what you study when you study volcanology is around volcanoes. Is not so much around the risk management, etc. Nowadays, and I'm going to say probably for the past 15 years, we've actually embarked on that far more. So there are some programs where you get taught that aspect as well. One aspect which is still not very much talked about is volcano monitoring on itself, and basically
Mm.
where you put those things together. So to answer your question about what I actually do, so it's about being a connector with people. It's about being an enabler for those decisions. At the end of the day, it's very much also pretty much like a medical doctor, where you're basically going to be looking at, we monitor volcanoes like we monitor a patient. So we look at a range of symptoms from different angles, and every symptom's got their own specialist. So my role, as the person coordinating that volcano monitoring in the country, is basically to be surrounded by people who are far smarter than I am, and who know their disciplines really well. So I'm going to have my brain surgeon, which basically looks after, say, the gas. I'm going to be having my gut surgeon, who's going to be looking at the deformation, and so on and so on. A seismologist, people looking at rocks, social scientists as well, in terms of how we communicate around risk, for instance. And my role is basically to understand all those languages and to basically facilitate the discussions so that we end up making either collective suggestions, or if we can't have a consensus, is basically ended up with a decision, maybe by voting, for instance, or by eliciting experts on specific questions, so that we understand as a collective what is our overall opinion, but also what is the uncertainty around that opinion, basically, and then we pass that on and connect that to people to enable to make decisions.
Amazing. That all came from sort of early on, like you say, you going to volcanoes, and then rather than looking at the volcano specifically, you're also looking, hey, there's quite a large community that's here, and sort of having that in the back of your mind, and how that sort of nudged your career into sort of keeping the bigger picture in your head at all at the same time, which I think is fascinating. And I think that leads us on to very nicely on this show. I always ask guests to come on and kind of share, one just incredible, significant story from their career. And we chatted sort of offline before about what that might be. And again, I think this is an incredible story that you were part of. And I wonder if you could just take us, maybe give us a little bit of a preface first about what happened, and then take us into how you got into it and how that all played out.
Sure. So I think when you asked me that question, Chris, one thing that came to mind was the Whakaari White Island eruption from 2019. So that's a small volcano that erupted in New Zealand, where 20 people got killed by that eruption. And I think the experience I'm happy to talk about is basically the week that followed that eruption, and pretty much how science has basically interacted or has fed into some of the recovery of the people who were deceased and left on island, but also how we helped with the overall thing. So in a nutshell, basically, Whakaari is a tiny submarine volcano north from New Zealand, so a few tens of kilometers north from the north coast of the North Island. And it's only the very tip that is coming out as a wee island. So the volcano is mostly underwater, but the very top is coming out of the water. And effectively, it's only a couple of kilometers across. It's tiny wee bit of an island. And it's got a horseshoe shape, which is the crater in there. So historically, we've had a long time ago, we used to have a sulfur mine in that volcano. Because sulfur was used for a number of things, and it was coming naturally. So, I mean, living in Indonesia, you know what it is in a lot of the volcanoes there, right? People carrying sulfur, etc. And then basically later on, it's been mostly used as a recreational area. So basically, over the past few decades now, it's been used as a tourism spot for people to come and just experience the beauty of volcanoes for a few hours, basically.
And then before that, how long was it a sulfur mine? For a long time,
so
right?
The sulfur mine was for maybe a few decades. Don't quote me on that. But it was basically at the turn of the previous century, pretty much.
So basically, long story short, for decades, many decades, people have been visiting this island, and I guess relatively without major incident.
Yeah, I think people have visited the island in different ways as well through time. So initially, you would have probably the boaties, as we call them here. People on ships, on boats will probably just land on the island and just have a look and just admire the whole thing. And then later on, I guess tourism has taken a bit more of a structure in some ways. So the island is a private island, which is quite peculiar as well. You have your own private volcano. And basically tourism operations have been run for a few decades now, mostly by boat, but also by helicopter. So it's it's probably fair to say that yes, tourism has happened at Whakaari for quite a long time. It's only more recently that it's been more organized, perhaps.
So take us through what happened on that tragic day in 2019.
So to understand what happened on the day, it might be useful just to talk very briefly about the previous weeks as well, just to give
Yeah,
that wider context.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
so Whakaari basically had been actually more than weeks, a few years, had been erupting on and on. Probably like in 2013, 12, we had some eruptions. We had some in 2016 as well. And the volcano tends to go through phases of increased activity, sometimes with eruptions, sometimes without. And then basically leading into 2019, a few months before the actual eruption in December, so that was on the 9th of December 2019. In the months prior to that, we could see with our instrumentation that the volcano was more active. So
Mm.
the one of the ways we communicate that, it's quite a blunt tool, but it's we use a number that kind of a number system, which is we call a volcanic alert level system. It is just one tool in the toolbox, but it's a way of telling how active the volcano is. Or if we go back to that patient analogy, is how sick the patient actually is. So
Yep.
the level in New Zealand go from 0 to 5, basically. 0, the volcano is not doing anything, super quiet. 1 and 2 means a bit more restless. So, and 2 is more restless. At level 3, this is when we've got eruptions, and then level 4 is a bigger eruption, and level 5 is a bigger eruption. So Whakaari, because it goes on and on like this, on and off, I would say all the time, it's always been pretty much level 1 in our current system. And weeks prior to the eruption, we had raised the alert level to 2, indicating that whilst we couldn't tell when an eruption would be happening, if at all, and also how likely it would be to happen, basically we knew that it was a bit more active leading to that.
And just quickly, I guess, because people hear a volcanic eruption, they think big lava being thrown into the air. What kind of when Whakaari erupts? What's entail? What does that entail?
Yeah, that's a good question, Grace. So it is. So it's quite variable through time. A volcano can have different types of eruptions, of course, but I would say over the past, let's call them 20 years, Whakaari has erupted in an explosive fashion. So it was not those nice lava flows. It's always,
Mm.
or majority of the case, it was basically more of an explosion, if you wish. And that explosion would be ejecting in the air some blocks, some boulders, would be ejecting some ash as well, and some toxic gases, effectively, and steam, all pretty hot. So that's probably been the main style of eruption for Whakaari in the recent decades. An important point, however, is that the eruptions Whakaari over the past decades have all been on the smaller end of things. So
Mm.
we're not talking about the large eruptions that people might have seen on TV, including Merapi, for instance, in your
Yep.
backyard, or Bromo, or the other volcanoes that we've seen. Um, Instead, those are small eruptions, but the challenge is that because the visitors were walking effectively in the crater, literally hundreds to tens of meters to where the action actually happens, it doesn't take a big eruption to affect dramatically the people on the island. So I think that's always been the conundrum here. Small eruptions, explosive in nature, not very big, but because of the proximity of people, it can have a dramatic impact, of course.
And so there were people on the island, as we mentioned, that if anyone would like to know more about this, obviously there's a great Netflix documentary, as well as ABC Four Corners did a couple of good documentaries on it, and you can read it. But I guess there were two groups on the island when it erupted. There were some survivors, obviously. There were some people that unfortunately didn't survive. Take us through, I guess, your first, what happened when you first heard about what was happening.
Yeah, so it was a Monday. So the day before is my birthday, basically. So we were basically just celebrating
Yeah.
with friends. And the Monday. So it was a Monday, and we had in the morning we actually had a meeting with some of the authorities that have to manage volcanic risk around other volcanoes, but also Whakaari. So we finished that meeting around lunchtime, pretty much. It was about an hour away from the office in Rotorua. I live in Taupo, which is a small town in the North Island. So we were basically finishing meetings about an hour away, and I was on my way back, driving back, And this is when I was driving, and I received a phone call from one of my colleagues who was supporting the on-call scientist. And basically, it was pretty straightforward and simple. Is Whakaari has erupted. So quite immediately, the weather was good. It was summertime. So because we're in the southern hemisphere, December is summer. And
Peak
of
summer,
course, in
yeah.
summer, this is where we've got more people visiting the island, of course. So the first question that immediately hits you is basically, were there people on the island? So I asked that question, and it wasn't clear at that point in time. So drove as quickly as I could back to the office there, where the team. So we had what we call a volcano duty officer. One of my colleagues was fantastic, and he was already very much onto it. Basically, liaising with the authorities, had raised the alert level, had issued already bulletins to say, "Hey, the volcano is erupted." We don't know much more than that at this stage, but just be aware of that, and also telling the aviation sector so that planes would try to
Yeah.
avoid the area because of the ash. And all my colleagues were basically on top of it, basically very much. And
So is it gone from a level 2, then you raise it to a 3 or a 4?
yeah, so normally we raise it to, if it's at level 2, which is the last level before an eruption. Um, if we've got a good evidence that it was a small eruption, we would raise it perhaps to 3, as an example. But we decided very early on that if, instead of actually agonizing over the details of, was it a big eruption, was it a medium-sized eruption, etc., in terms of t-shirt size, basically small, medium, large, if we didn't have clear evidence that it would be a size small, we would basically have a size medium, and we'll basically raise it to level 4 until proven otherwise. So this is what we did on the day, because the webcams that we had on the island had pretty
Yeah.
much been all covered by the ash from the eruption. So
Wow.
quite quickly, we became
You were
quite
blind.
blind in terms of what was happening.
Yeah.
And the only one we still had working was from the coast, so a few tens of kilometers away, where we had seen basically the plume from there. But then we didn't quite have a clear idea of, how big it could be, etc. So conservatively, we say let's be quick here, and my colleagues basically said, let's raise it to 4. Let's tell everybody that something has happened, and then we'll downgrade that as soon as we can when we've got more evidence.
Wow. So you're kind of into the office straight away trying to deal with what's happening. I'm sure, as your colleague was dealing with the authorities who were scrambling to, mount rescue operations. And, I mean, how much information did you have from the authorities about what was going on? You knew, I guess you knew by this point that people were on the island.
Yeah, so we learned. So the eruption was at 2:11 in the afternoon, and basically we heard quite quickly through quick conversations with the authorities, with police, etc. One of my other colleagues had gone to the police station in Rotorua before taking his flight back to Wellington, so that he could start interacting with police as well. And basically, all of us were all relaying information from the central part, so that we could make sure the message was consistent through time. And basically, but through those bits of intel, we learned quite quickly that there were some people on the island. So I told my colleagues out there back at the office, that's the information I just got, which of course put a bit of a pause in the conversation, because we all knew intimately that people on the islands probably meant that people got hurt there.
So you obviously have the office situation, but I guess in a situation like this where there's such a very difficult crisis, there would be like a central rallying point for all the authorities, the police, the ambulances, like a kind of control center, as it were. Were you kind of like going down there and everyone sort of turning towards you and go, "Hey, Mr. Volcanologist, Mr. Volcano Expert, what do we do? What do we do?" kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first few hours, usually for those any kind of response, to be honest, the response tend to be quite distributed, I would say,
Mm,
just because they don't have the luxury of the time to all go into a single place before actually acting. So the reflex tasking is already built into agency response plans, basically. So you operate in a distributed fashion. But then as soon as you've got the opportunity, you try to actually bring people together for that. So for me, that was after the first few hours on the day. And we knew by by 5 p.m., so that was less than 3 hours after the eruption, that there weren't any survivors left on the island. So people had been evacuated. Some of them survived, some of them died, unfortunately. And we knew that there were some deceased, unfortunately, who had remained on island. For a number of reasons, it was decided the volcano at the time was still mildly erupting. There was still stuff going on. The level of uncertainty was huge. So at the time, it was decided by the authorities that they would pause on the rescue operations because there weren't anybody left alive on the island. So it became a recovery operation for which the risk threshold and risk appetite is a bit lower because you don't have any lives to save. So it's a massive conundrum because the first thing you want to do is absolutely get those people back to their families and to their loved ones, and on the other hand, you have to weight two risks between the risk of the taken by the people going on the island. So not an easy task at all by police and whomever was making the decision there.
I mean, it is. I think it's worth mentioning just very briefly. So there were some very heroic efforts by the local tour groups and helicopter companies that acted very quickly, in response to what was going on, and undoubtedly saved lives in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Saved, yeah. So some people came back. So some tour operators came back with helicopters, indeed, with the boats as well. Immediately when they heard that an eruption had occurred. And those guys basically didn't agonize over their own safety at the time. They just did what they felt was the right thing, and they ought to be absolutely applauded for their courage there. And they did save life by doing this. They did.
And I guess at that point, once you've kind of in that situation, were you? I guess your job, your role in the grand scheme of things was kind of like the point person for all of the different authorities, kind of figuring out what was going on. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so basically when we essentially finished a few hours of response, which were, I guess, reflex tasking and I guess kind of remotely done, where we were interacting there, we got into a phase from the following morning at dawn, basically, of trying to actually consolidate that effort into a single operation. So this is where my role became more prominent as the main single point of contact and advisor for the local authorities. We also had some of my colleagues who were back in Wellington, where we've got our own government. So we were able to also have people feeding information to the central government. But for the local operation, I was the representative of our team out there and the main advisor. So back to your question as to what happens when you first walk into that room in the morning. Basically big silence. People turn around and ask, so is it safe to go? And that's the question you have to try to unpack, basically. And that's what we did over the... Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And is it safe to go? Can we go back to the island? And that's essentially what we did over the following days with a team. It's by no means just one person, me. It's basically a team of God knows how many of scientists, of authorities, of everybody who's been working really closely together to come up with a plan, basically.
And those people, I think it was 8 people left on the island who had sort of died during the event. I mean, were the families there, were you speaking to them? Were they pressuring you to go there and retrieve those bodies as soon as possible?
Yeah, so I think, I talked to some of the families there, to the families of Aidan, who was one of the guides there, and got to form a wonderful relationship with his mum and some of his families as well. On the day, basically, one of the things I had to do effectively was to talk to some of the families to say, hey, this is the reason why collectively at the moment we feel we cannot just go back to the island, and this is a very difficult conversation to have. Because the last thing you want is basically prevent people from having the loved ones coming back. So the way we went about it was just sitting together. I had my laptop on my knees, going through data, but without necessarily geeking out on the data. It was not the point. It was very much around being able to illustrate in a few points that everybody could relate to why that was. And one of the things was that although the volcano had erupted the day before, but like typically on the Monday, the activity we were recording underground with our seismometers and all our instruments was showing that at first it was pretty quiet initially, and then the activity underground started to pick up. So that was the biggest challenge, is that all those plans we had to come up with and all those decisions we had to make as to whether or not we could get a team back on island to recover those deceased people was done at a time where everything was indicated that the activity was increasing underground. So there could be an eruption, could be a bigger eruption, etc. So what I will say is that uncomfortable, has heartbreaking those conversations were. I will say that I was absolutely amazed by the humanity that I had in front of me with the families of the people who were missing, and when they nod their head and say, yeah, okay, we understand. We may not agree with it because, of course, that's not what you want, but we understand why this is not happening right now. I cannot express how impressed I am by people being able to do that, just going beyond their own grief and basically yet have rational conversations and being understanding.
I can't. I mean, that's usually a job for, like, I don't know, a police commissioner or like someone, like the local mayor or something like that. But the fact that it fell on your shoulders to come and explain to these people what was going on, was that something you volunteered for, or someone sort of decided you were the best person to do it?
Yeah, I think the way it worked at the time was I was asked by police whether I could explain things, and I think in that particular case, the because I was I was probably the best person in that area to be able to explain the data, I guess. So I think it came from that place. For me, what probably helped in many ways is that outside of volcanology, I also have other passions which relate to mountain rescue, which I've done for a few decades, and where I'm used to those conversations as well with people, unfortunately, when we've got some accidents in the mountains. Likewise, more recently been working as an ambulance officer, basically. So all those things bring the medical side of things, but also the patient liaison and the family liaison with when someone passes, etc., is something that I was you never are comfortable with it, or certainly I don't feel I will ever be. But certainly it's something that I felt I had been through a few times in different circumstances. It was a different conversation, but it just felt the right thing to do, to be honest. So you just step up and just go with it.
They're amazingly lucky to have someone who obviously understands the science, but also, has the experience to deal with these kinds of, traumatic, tragic situations as well. So I guess from that point onwards, you'd explain to the families, look, you can see from the data, we're not going to risk more lives by sending people there right now to recover the deceased. But there was still a pressure to go back there. It's not like we can leave them for months on end until, the volcano is in a quote unquote quiet phase. What happened over the next kind of couple of days, next few days?
Yeah, so the pressure you're talking about is coming both from the desire from the families to get their loved ones back. It was also contextual. So in New Zealand, and for me that was one of the big learnings from that experience as well, is that everything is contextual, or context is everything. And so for the wider context, before that eruption, a few years prior, we had a mining incident called the Pike River disaster, where there was a mining incident in the South Island, and some miners got killed and buried, and the bodies were basically not retrieved for a number of reasons. So one of the first things that I got told when I walked into that room on day 2, basically, was very much, this is another expletive Pike River disaster, where we cannot let people down. We have to actually go and get those people back. So I think that was probably why there was also that added level of scrutiny and added level of incentive to get the people back. So basically, what happened over the following days was, there were multiple facets, but the big picture is that we had to understand how safe, or how unsafe is probably a better way to put it. It was to potentially send teams on the island to recover those bodies. It was to come up with a plan of action, in terms of how that would be happening. And it was to provide some form of recommendation of PPE, tactical operations, etc. And then on the day, it was basically basically doing a risk assessment as well. And on the day, very much participating to the operations from either a boat or from a helicopter on the second one, to basically being what is called the guardian angel in the New Zealand system, which is basically a subject matter expert that would be around to say, hey, military may be super good at what they do, but they don't necessarily understand volcanoes. So the subject matter expert is going to be a volcanologist who will be able to provide some more informed opinion in terms of what's happening on the ground. So one of the things I had to do was basically effectively giving the final green light from a science point of view, and then basically effectively being the person to pull the plug on the operations while people were on the islands for the recovery operations in case something was happening, basically. So so that was one of the facets of things we had to do.
So did that mean, as that guardian angel with the power to pull the plug if you needed to, were you out, on a boat near the island, looking at stuff, assessing stuff with your own eyes? What happened then?
Yeah, so I guess leading to that, we had to come up with a bit of a plan. So we had two recovery operations. The first one, so the eruption was on a Monday, and then all the risk assessment, the planning, and I can dive into that a bit more if you want later, were in the following days between Tuesday effectively and Thursday. So basically three very intense days, probably the most intense days of my career.
Because this has never happened before. There was no precedent for this, and there was no rule book or guidebook, and you guys had to write it.
Yeah, pretty much so. I mean, there have been some reflex rescues around volcanoes. One comes to mind in Galeras, in Colombia, where there was an eruption with volcanologists actually who were involved and injured or killed, and there were some like rescues by the people who were around, but coming up with actually an organized way to go about it. As you say, there is no manual, and we pretty much had to write it. So the plan there was the planning phase was for the 3 days following the eruption, and then basically we had two recovery operations. One was on the Friday, the first one, and then the second one was on the Sunday, effectively. So 2 days later. For those two operations, my role on the day was to basically, the first one was being based on one of the boats with effectively eyes on the volcano at all times throughout the day, and using some of the military technology they had around infrared, etc., and some pretty powerful optics as well, trying to actually understand what was happening at the crater itself, whether the volcano was erupting, whether anything was changing. And at the same time, had basically a team of people back at the office who were looking at the data in real time and feeding me information about things that would be might or might not happen, whether the activity was changing, etc. And our more experienced seismologist, who was basically his role was to alert me if something was untoward. And I remember quite vividly that conversation we had the night before, where first and foremost, I told him, hey, I need the most experienced person we've got for that, and that person is you. Would you agree to do that? And amazingly, he said yes without even skipping a bit. Basically, it was just absolutely amazing. And the other thing was, well, he was asking me what kind of threshold. What is your threshold there for me to call you? Yeah. And my best answer at the time was, when it makes you sick in the stomach.
That was your metric.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. And I think what I was trying to say at that point in time, and I didn't have to explain more than that. I think he meant exactly he understood exactly what I meant at the time, or totally ignore my what I was saying as well. I don't know, but I think it's about trying to. It is basically putting those decades of experience into basically pretty much going with your intuition, effectively.
Yeah. When you start feeling this is too much. So it was literally, there is no like scientific red line. It's just like, when you feel this is too much, you call me.
Yeah, that's right. And it
That's
was fed
crazy.
by the science. So it was by no means
Yeah.
esoteric whatsoever. It was really fed by those decades of experience, but literally distilling it to a point where you feel there is something, the hair raising at the back of your neck, stomach is not feeling right. This is where I want you to call me, basically.
That's incredible. So you said there's two rescue operations, and were you on out there for both of them out in the field? And
Yes, I was
yeah,
out there on both, basically. Yep, yep.
yeah. And so you were there, eyes on, phone at the ready in case your colleague was going to call you. And then this, I think it was the New Zealand Army that was actually on the ground, and you guys would have gone out by presumably boat or aircraft
Yes,
to do the recovery.
yeah. So it was a, I mean, it was a phenomenal effort, to be honest, and probably one of the most amazing operations I've ever witnessed or ever been part of. So it was a mixture of New Zealand Defence Force, of police, experts from fire and emergency services, basically a mixture of everything. So we use drones from our fire services, who have got excellent capabilities. So we used that first to actually locate where the people were on the island, so that we could actually
Wow.
understand exactly where they were. And this is where there is also an interesting development later, where we knew there were 8 people on the island, but we could only find 6. And there is a backstory there at the end as well, of
Yeah.
why we think we couldn't find those 2 people. But we had basically drones from FENS, from Fire and Emergency New Zealand. We had a navy. We had police from basic explosive ordnance surveys as well. So one of the biggies is that we needed people to go on the island, or teams to go on the island, who would be able to use effectively like fully autonomous respiratory apparatus, basically. And there
Wow.
aren't that many teams that are actually trained for that. So we had people who were
Yeah.
trained already, and who were able to operate in those conditions. So the broad plan, if you wish, for certainly the first operation, was that we were based out of a boat, which was of a navy boat, which was off the island a little bit, and then basically we deployed people on the team, on the island, basically using inflatable boats,
Oh yeah,
basically.
little
So
yeah.
and the intent was for those guys went to the island there, fully geared up, and coming up with a plan, and the whole thing was yet another experience. I can talk about it as well. But basically, in a nutshell, the overview is that those teams went on the island, identified the deceased bodies, the persons, and basically, because you have to make sure you also do due diligence to the identification. You can't
Yeah.
just rush grab. You have to actually do an absolute minimum of identification and due diligence to the process, and respectfully as well, right? Um, and then basically the intent was for those guys to basically group the bodies in a few areas around the island, and then those got picked up by helicopter and brought back on the ship afterwards. And then the people basically were the teams then basically deployed back to to the ship, or through the small boats as well. At the same time, we had a big boat. We also had a few smaller boats that were located closer to the island in safe areas, or kind of sheltered areas, where if something was going terribly wrong on the island for anybody, they could basically having some rescue of the recoverers, basically.
Okay, great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I just have this. You were mentioning the navy boats there, and I just have this image of you with a bunch of hardened sailors. And I don't know about you, but I'm not great on rough seas. How did you cope trying to do a really difficult job, but on the boat as well?
Well, there is a very good reason, Chris, why I stick to mountaineering and alpinism. Is that basically I'm really not a sea person. I mean, I've done a bit of sailing, and I love diving, but I'm certainly not boat worthy. That's probably an understatement. So, and it's probably even worse whenever we actually stop the boat, and
Yeah.
if you add that to lack of sleep, to basically having to walk through, to actually look at through quite heavy
Oh,
heavy duty
binoculars. Yeah.
binoculars throughout the day, etc.
Oof.
That did my head in really quickly. So the whole day was spent literally eyes on what was happening, and vomiting abundantly, basically at the same time.
Oh
Um,
God, so
so, but
difficult.
difficult, but at the same time, you have a really clear, like everything in life. If you've got a really clear vision of what you're trying to achieve, you just go over those things. Basically, just keep doing.
Wow. Amazing. And there was no sort of like back of your mind, like, actually, I'll just stand on the jetty. Just put me on the jetty of the island. I'll look at it from there.
No, so I mean, we had a lot of conversation as to whether or not it was best for me to be based on the boat or on the island. For a number of reasons, being on the island wasn't really the decision that was made. Probably too close to the action, and not adding any benefit, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then also basically, I think it was possibly a way to test my stomach as well for some very very unknown reason.
So the recovery events, there's two of them, and I guess both were kind of similar in how they were executed to a certain degree.
Broadly speaking, so the overview, if you wish, of the first one, the intent for the first recovery operation, well, the intent was to have only one, and to actually recover all the 8 people who were left on the island on the first operation. But this is when we only found 6 of them, and 2 were not to be found anywhere. So this is the purpose of the second recovery operation on the Sunday, so 2 days later, was to try and find those 2 people that we couldn't find on day 1. And in a nutshell, basically, once we've reconstructed, I'll give you the short version, but once we reconstructed what we felt happened on the island on the day of the eruption, is that the eruption occurred in the afternoon. People got killed pretty much on the spot there. So people who were killed on the island and left on the island were quite close to the crater. And we knew that 2 of those unfortunate people were in small gullies, basically. So we've got some dry riverbeds, if you wish, on the islands, or some with a bit of hot springs coming down and a bit of hot water coming down. But that we knew that the 2 of them at least were in such gullies. What we realized later on by doing some detective work was that night following the eruption, quite a what I tend to call a weather bomb, which is absolutely not a meteorological term, but then my colleagues there will hate me for that. But basically, like a very condensed period of very heavy rain occurred, and very localized, and occurred on the island. And what we think happened at the time is we actually recorded on our seismometers, which were still operating at the time, a bit of a weird signal that we've seen elsewhere and that we know had been associated with mud flows. So what we reconstructed at the time is that the night following the eruption, we had a lot of heavy rain for a short period of time that they caused some mud flows, and those mud flows went into the gullies and basically carried out those 2 bodies basically out to sea. So one of them was briefly glimpsed at I think when on the first recovery operation, or even on the days actually following the eruption, but it was a little bit unclear still in terms of what was happening there. So the purpose for the second recovery operation was really to see whether or not, as they were carried to the sea, whether or not there was any chance at all that they had been buried in the stream rather than carried out all the way to sea. So basically we had a team of police experts there who came with probes effectively, and they basically probed that particular stream all the way, just to make sure literally no stone was left unturned, that we were not leaving anybody who could be found. And the result of that second recovery operation was that we couldn't find those 2 people, and then that's the only logical and likely conclusion was that they had been basically washed to sea, unfortunately, and never to be seen. So the interesting thing there is that the 2 people who could not be found were Hayden, who was a guide, a well-loved, affable guide out there who's got a huge amount of experience and love for the area. And the second person was a younger lady a visitor, basically. And so there is a bit of I guess, a thought that he's taking care of her out there, and he's being there, the kaitiaki and the guardian, basically, and he's just taking care of her while they are there. So she's not alone. They're not alone, but they've been washed at sea, and we haven't been able to recover them, unfortunately.
I think that was one of the things I picked up from the Netflix documentary, is they interviewed the local Maori leader. And he was talking about how, in Maori legend, the role of Whakaari as a a god or a goddess, and how now they're under their goddess's protection and all this kind of stuff. So it's nice to have the Maori sort of perspective on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the local iwi, so the local Maori tribe, was involved very early on in terms of also trying to make sure that whatever was done in terms of the recovery operation was done in a respectful way from a cultural standpoint for all involved. So we had basically elders come up to us, basically going with the boat before that to do a blessing of the island before the recovery operations went, etc. So it was quite a emotionally powerful week as well, even from that point of view, where everybody was trying to do their bit from a different angle, and also in the healing afterwards. So I think one of the things that often is missed, perhaps, when that event is seen from overseas, is the role of the communities, of the local communities, to help the survivors, to help the families of the deceased, or the families of those who were affected. And same for the local iwi. They've been absolutely phenomenal in terms of providing some support and emotional support, etc. And every year we've had some ceremonies, basically just acknowledging the event. And last year was the 5 year of the 5th anniversary of the eruption, where we had people coming from overseas to just to pause, to reflect, to acknowledge that. And the iwi hosted us basically in that event, and it was just a privilege, basically, to be part of such a powerful moment.
And that's a wrap on part 1 of my conversation with Nico Fournier. A huge thanks to Nico again for his honesty and his insights in walking us through what was, in his words, probably one of the most intense days of his career. And as always, a big thanks to all of you as well for listening and watching. If you'd like to learn more about Nico's work or anything that we've discussed in today's episode, you'll find the links in the show notes and over on the website, noordinarymonday.com. And you can also find full video versions of these episodes on YouTube. And we also post regularly on our socials across Instagram, LinkedIn, and on the No Ordinary Monday podcast community over on Facebook. Come and say hello. Next week, the story takes a different turn. What happens after the ash settles? Who is held accountable? We'll explore the investigations that followed and the uncomfortable reality of making decisions in a world where certainty doesn't exist. And then we zoom out to the much bigger question. If predicting one volcano is this hard, what does it mean for the ones capable of changing the planet? So make sure you're following the show so you don't miss out. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are 4 simple ways that you can support us. Number 1, follow or subscribe on your podcast app. Number 2, leave a rating or review. Number 3, share the episode with a friend, a family member, or maybe a colleague. And then number 4, support the show at buymeacoffee.com/noordinarymonday. Any one of these things helps us keep the show independent, advert-free, and allows me to keep bringing you thoughtful, story-driven conversations week after week. And that's it for this episode. This podcast is independently produced, hosted, and edited by me, Chris Barron. Thank you so much for listening. Take care, and we'll see you next Monday.